right? We're gonna walk and talk together after all this.
In addition to losing the input for his regular microphone, he also forgot the clip for one of the lapel mics. So every time he turns the camera this way, I'm going to be holding my hand like this.
Well, I was holding my hand for 90 minutes for the previous video, and I'm still holding it now. I feel like you're getting the easier time this time around.
I mean, that's possible, but you know, it's also your channel, so I feel like the responsibility for the equipment falls on you.
So we were talking about Noam Chomsky shortly before this, and you mentioned that he's kind of like widely considered a liberal now. He calls himself a liberal, and I guess this is true, right? Primarily in the sense that, I mean, when it comes down to it, he would deny that this is in fact the case, but I think if you do throw your weight behind the Democratic Party, more or less, no matter what, right? There's people that try to essentially like create a different kind of story for this. You might say stuff like, "Oh, it's not that I would vote for absolutely anybody. I just happen to think that Joe Biden is good enough." But really, that means that pretty much anybody is good enough.
If Joe Biden's good enough, then there's, I mean, the floor is many miles below the Earth's crust.
Yeah, I mean, there's no one there realistically that would be unacceptable, to a Joe Biden voter, right? I believe, obviously, like a Joe Biden voter might not vote for Hitler, but Hitler is not going to be in the Democratic Party, right? So pretty much every realistic choice in the primary results, people would vote for them. And, there's been complaints like, oh, he doesn't get enough attention. He's not really featured in the New York Times. But I wonder, like, do you think that's actually true? Like, has he not gotten enough attention? Because I feel like he is very well known. That's the irony, right?
Well, I hopefully this gets picked up.
It'll fade out.
I think he's gotten more mainstream attention as the things that he was especially trenchant on, like basically the Vietnam era of politics, have sort of faded into the background.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in a more postmodern era, the idea of manufacturing consent is not really a blaringly brilliant insight for the average person anymore, because basically every aspect of our lives are some form of manufactured consent or other. The arenas for a person to really drive their own politics and choices are becoming vanishingly small against the oncoming waves of modernity. So the idea that, oh, the media, the government sometimes colludes with the media in order to create the pretense for its actions that, if they were really considered on their merits, probably would not stand up to scrutiny. It's like, fucking duh.
Mm-hmm.
That's not really a brilliant insight anymore. And, especially in the era of online, there's so many contrarian takes that exist in every sphere. Like, he's got more prestige than the average person, but in a sea of people just saying things, whatever thing comes to their brain, no matter how well considered or poorly considered, then there really is no difference between Noam Chomsky and anybody else. So he's pretty safely recuperable in that context. So I think there probably was a period of time where he had some insight into the state of things that could have been valuable to a left movement or a liberal movement or whatever. But at this point, he's over 90 years old. I mean, there's got to be a point where you stop expecting someone to have like novel contributions. And I would say their 90th anniversary of their entry onto this planet is probably, as good of a cutoff point as any. But also, I mean, what would it even mean for somebody to be influential as like a public intellectual or whatever anymore? Like, basically, I mean, you could make a solid case that maybe the most influential public intellectual or philosopher of the last decade is fucking Alexander Dugin, and it's just that just might be because he psyoped Vladimir Putin into thinking that an aggressive invasion of Ukraine in order to defend the Russian Volk or the Eurasianists project or whatever was a good idea, but otherwise it's basically just a big soup of people saying things anymore. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a big Chomsky head. I think there are some people that are too hard on him. There are some people that are not hard enough on him. I mean, no matter what you want to say, he bought into the propaganda of the Khmer Rouge hook, line, and sinker. So talk about your manufactured consent. He certainly does not always check the back of the box to see the country in which the consent for the thing that he is engaging with was manufactured. But ultimately, yeah, he tells people to vote for Democrats. That's why he's never been some kind of revolutionary, and he's not even a revolutionary in the field of consciousness or whatever. I mean, he's always been conservative relative to certain. I mean, there's the famous Chomsky-Foucault debates. I mean, the idea that there is such a thing as human nature. I mean, as intuitive and obvious as that seems to someone like you and me, that's a conservative position relative to the academy in the parts of the 20th century in which he was in the academy.
Yeah, it's
So
fascinating to watch that debate now, simply because I don't know how different things were back in the day. I mean, to whatever extent, I guess Foucault might have been a representation of a lot of kind of like left-ish thinking at the time. But at the same time, like a lot of what Chomsky's saying would be just total heresy right now, right? And one thing that I've always appreciated about
it
him,
was
just
heresy for the time too. It's actually probably less
really,
heresy now than it was back then. I mean, I would say post-structuralism is definitely on the decline and probably has been for. I mean, it's definitely still got its place in the academy, but in terms of like public intellectuals or whatever, that's certainly not the mode that most of them are operating in anymore. I mean, they're pretty much mostly just liberals right now, or weird reactionaries.
you think it would be foolish to try to cross this like little channel?
Uh,
I mean,
well, there's some stones down there. You could probably cross it.
I mean, let's try it. I mean, I honestly do feel kind of drunk. Keith is saying that he really doesn't feel it that much, but I'm a very small. Oh my god, I should not be doing this while I'm. Oh, people are getting so much fucking value right now. Goodness, you used to just seeing me just like walking around and shit. Now you're seeing me hiking, drunk. Oh, look. Oh, very simple stones.
Yes.
Very easy. Look at that. Some wishing rocks. What do you think they wished for?
I think that's between them and God, whichever God they have.
Jesus.
Hopefully, one of the good ones.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of hard to gauge how far things have come in terms of, uh, well, how far are we from like the acceptance of human nature and stuff like that? Because I feel like there's definitely a huge amount of fear on the left still about the science of biology, because for all kind of like leftist talk that exists, there is still like a huge contingent that doesn't actually, they don't really buy it, right? Like, I could imagine a large swath of the left essentially giving up a project of equality if it turns out that there is like genetic sort of long term, very difficult to correct differences in things like intelligence, right, across races. Right? Not that I accept that; I think that's total bullshit. But I can imagine a large swath of the left sort of like totally giving up that argument because they haven't really thought about the implications of all that.
Well, it's really just a matter of, it depends on what your leftism is. If your leftism is about equalizing everybody, then you're probably not going to get very far with it, because people are unequal. I mean, they're just regardless of everything else, they're just different people.
Yeah.
Whether how much of that is nature or nurture, or if that's even a coherent dichotomy, which it mostly isn't, although there is a rational kernel at the core of what it brings to mind.
Who was the one that wrote that article, "Nature's Nurture," for the website
Uh,
Automachination?
I
Somebody did that.
I don't remember. Len Holman, maybe. That seems like something he might write.
No, this
But
was like sometime in the last couple of months. Somebody did a Nature's Nurture, a title that I thought was nice.
yeah,
But anyway, there was somebody.
yeah,
What about that Zeke? What about that Ezekiel Yu at automachination.com? Now he's really become a bit of a monster, hasn't he?
yeah. He's a talented writer.
Yeah.
It's too bad that there is not a literary climate that is just just wet with money like there was in like the 1950s or whatever, because he could definitely Zeke could eke out a decent living for himself if there was
Hmm.
more just free cash floating around that space.
Yeah. In the next couple of months or so, I'm going to get back to a more regular schedule of writing prose, simply because I need to start preparing again for the book I'm doing next year, which is like criticism. But it's going to be like sort of you know somewhere between James Baldwin and Woody Allen reel to reel,
Mm,
right? In terms of just getting at both, like I want like a robust critique of the '90s, everything from politics to culture to
mm-hmm,
movies, like everything. So it's going to be like a long book,
mm-hmm.
but at the same time, I want to like push ahead into like more personal shit, stuff that like before I wasn't really able to write about that easily, right? Because I had some of the defenses up.
Mm-hmm.
But now, like, I just feel it's a lot easier for me to just say whatever I want to say. I guess that's just like a function of age, but it's just become much easier. So I'm going to
Yeah,
be doing more prose, and it's good to have somebody like Zeke nearby doing that, because you start seeing like all the different directions, and you could sort of start, you map out both the influences as well as the ways that it's kind of like all maybe uniquely him,
mm-hmm.
because he's definitely becoming more and more of a kind of like unique writer. And I'm gonna do with Dan this Dan and Zeke actually this artifact next month on just like bad art YouTube channels, and they're like bad criticism and all this other stuff. And I think for the bonus show we're gonna do like an all about Zeke kind of thing. Where I think it's time. Right? I think it's time to sort of shine a little spotlight on Zeke, Ezekiel Yu.
Yeah, he does get. That's. I mean, this is probably my own ignorance speaking, but I can't think of a prominent like Filipino American writer other than who's that one that wrote for like Slate and all those. The one who it turned out her parents were doing some kind of weird labor trafficking thing with teachers from the
I don't
Philippines.
know anything about this.
Yeah,
That sounds like a funny story.
yeah. I mean, it's just not a prominently represented viewpoint. But speaking as somebody that works in American hospitals, it is a prominent American positionality. I'll tell you that much. So it is an influence on American culture that I don't think has actually made its way into the cultural sphere as
Yeah.
much. I mean, they provide a lot of the uh, basically material security and support that Americans rely on every day. If you need to go to the hospital, there's
Hmm.
pretty good chance that you're going to have at least one Filipino nurse, unless you work somewhere really out of the way.
Yeah.
Um,
I actually, so last night I was working more on that Robin DiAngelo, white fragility, white guilt type of video essay, almost a little bit like a documentary, honestly. And I'm discussing the part where I'm sure you've seen this before. There's this kind of like trope in, like, let's just call it, PC anti-racist writing, where they talk about stuff like, oh, I'm upset at the fact that I'm like a black scholar or whatever, and I showed up at this event and they thought I was the janitor, or they thought I was a waiter, or they thought that I was whatever, right?
mhm.
Um, and the thing that always rubs me the wrong way about that is, like, for example, Robin DiAngelo, she characterizes one Filipino poet, and I guess he's a National Book Award winner. And when I looked up his poems, they seemed to like mostly suck. There was one that had like some good lines and some good images and some good ideas, but for the most part, they just kind of sucked, were pretty flat. And I mean, first of all, this guy is like not a deserving of a National Book Award, as is, pretty much any other poet that ever receives it. This isn't an
I was
anti-Filipino
gonna say
thing.
he's a published modern poet. It's like a 99.9%
Yeah, exactly.
chance that they've got one good poem, maybe,
Yeah, exactly. And
and
the way
probably
that
not
she
even that.
characterized it was like, he wrote brilliant. No, he wrote poignantly about the pain of being mistaken for a waiter at a black tie event meant to commemorate National Book Award winners. And it's like, what exactly is the pain? What exactly are we talking about? Are we just talking about, like, is this kind of like a class issue? Is that really what it is?
Well,
It's kind of like but it's kind of like a simulated class issue, because tons of blue collar workers at this point are doing a lot better, financially, than a lot of white collar workers. Just like a poet. I mean, you're not actually a poet, right? You're like a professor somewhere. You're not living off of your poetry. It's very
mm-hmm.
rare. So, it's like this odd thing where it's just a ton of classist sort of assumptions, or like simulated classist assumptions, even if they're like misperceptions. The fact is, it's like that's just all it is.
Well, I mean, I understand that there is depth at a group level to the feeling of, like, exclusion
Mm-hmm.
or outsiderness or whatever. But the thing is, even if you, like, I'm sure he didn't write greatly and deeply about that. That's the thing.
Yeah.
Like, it's not even. I'm not even going to question the premises of the argument. Just, I'm sure if you actually read the poem that she is referencing, it's not anything like she described it. It's probably a banal screed, like most of that
Mm-hmm.
kind of stuff is.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's good, then good. But based on, I mean, I trust your critique of most poetry, and it sounds like he does the same thing that almost every other poetry professor does, because poetry is not a popular art form. Poetry is a niche uh, space that has basically been taken over by people that don't really have the wherewithal to do like historical scholarship in
Mm-hmm.
the field of, like various ethnic studies or racial studies or gender studies or whatever. So they just do creative expressions where they can play very loosely with actual factuality and get away with it. And I'm not saying that, like, that's not any worse of a grift than a lot of stuff that happens in academia, but like give me a break. You are basically living off the residual fumes of a once vital art form.
Yeah.
You don't get to not really care about the art form and also like steal valor from it.
Yeah, I recently came across this one like NFT poet. He calls himself DGen poet, which is supposed to be a reference to crypto degenerates that are just kind of like gambling on crypto, as opposed to maybe investing in stuff, aping into shit coins and shit like that. And it's like there's no. I was sending this to like Joe Parrish, like some text with like images of the shit. It's like he would have like a fucking like picture of Charmander, and
Mm-hmm.
like the only so-called poetry would be like, first of all, would be like a bunch of random letters, like X X X X X X, like all over to like make up, I guess, maybe the body or the figure of Charmander. And then
Mm-hmm.
like on his body, you would have like a little bit of text that says Char or something. It's like so stupid,
Yeah.
right? And this is exact. Honestly, like I don't blame the degens, and I don't blame the NFT types. I blame the art world as a whole.
Yeah.
That essentially said, for many decades now, that all this is permissible. Anything is permissible. You
Yeah.
can do whatever you want,
Well,
right?
I
It's
mean,
it's not it's
the,
not
the the
necessarily all
only
that worse
vital
than.
form of poetry from a cultural perspective is rap, and rap is not good poetry. So,
Yeah.
like, rap is entirely dependent on the flow and the delivery and the beat that gets written by producers and studio hacks and whatnot in order to give it some substance and body. That if you just had the words on the page, the very simple rhyme schemes and alliteration and use of metaphor and other such things that probably 99% of rappers engage in would not stand out, in the entire history of poetry. It would be,
Yeah.
it would read, compared to what was being achieved in America in like the early to mid 20th century, it would read like Aesop's fable stuff,
Yeah.
and I mean, again, that's not even a dig at, like, it's hard to dig at anything at this point because everything is just so deracinated and hollowed out of like any sort of substance. Like,
Mm-hmm.
there's basically no way to be like, I mean, there's like probably a small handful of people in any given medium that do it, but there's very little realistic way to be both substantial and successful and
Yeah.
have any cultural impact. Like, that's basically an impossible trifecta. And so, like, I don't get mad at people, but I do get mad at the, like, you know, at the notion, oh, this was a National Book Award winning poet, or it
Mm-hmm.
was the poet laureate of the United States. Like, those things have really ever meant anything, but definitely ever meant anything in the last 50 years, you know?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, and this is by people that don't, like, do you think Robin DiAngelo regularly reads
Of
poetry?
course not.
Yeah, like, she's read his poetry, and she's probably read a lot of that kind of like ethnic studies type of poetry, which
Mm-hmm.
is, you know, I mean, it's basically just like diaristic uh, expression of an actual, like a political movement that has actual weight to it. But, you know, frankly, poetry is not the medium where that stuff has taken off. It's television.
Mm-hmm.
It's TV shows now where
Yeah.
where that has a substantial portion of woke people that work for it, you
Yeah.
know, and where a critical mass of Americans and other people actually engage with that stuff, you know.
Yeah.
You should feel lucky that you get to write poems about that kind of stuff, because that nobody gives a shit. They want to
Mm-hmm.
watch TV shows about it.
Yeah. Speaking of rap, when I was preparing to do that DJ Vlad video, I was looking up some commentary about Eminem. Eminem being somebody that would just like flat out refuse to appear on a DJ Vlad interview series for whatever reason. I mean, it could just be that he's. I mean, he doesn't have to do interviews, although he has done other interviews. Right? He's done the Sway interview. He's done a few others recently. So all that happens, but all these. So like basically, I was like reading stuff and looking stuff up about Eminem, and so Snoop Dogg started this commentary, and he was like, "I'm sorry, I know that most rappers, black or white, have said that Eminem is top 5, top 10, but to me, he can't be top 10 because there's all those rappers in the 80s," and it's like, you know, just like totally missing the mark, right?
Yeah.
I agree that Eminem can't be in the top 10, but I would never say it's because there's all those rappers in the 80s, right? It's like if you look at so much of 80s rap, I mean, some of it is good, some of it works on other levels, but compared to like the best of the 90s, it's clear that it was something that was just starting out, right?
Yeah.
It was not something that was actually really developed in any substantial way.
Yeah.
So,
you know, it's hard because in the video game space, I think probably the most interesting video games that have yet been made. Here? What's up?
There's some kind of like whatever this is. You know, if you're gonna give me a little tunnel of some sort, right, underground with my sort of like inner mole.
Yes.
It's just a goddamn road. If you want to walk with all the fumes, the Central Park, oh, look at that. Ooh.
12 feet. If you stacked 2 of me,
yeah,
it would hit my head.
It's funny to look at this because I feel like, you know, if I had to be carried out on the stretcher with a boner, I wouldn't fit.
Anyway, in a lot of ways, the most interesting video games that have been made got made in the 80s and 90s, but the technology that was used to produce them is like so unappealing if you have any of experience of like modern video gaming. Like if you look back at like old Fallout games or things like that, like the level of complexity relative to the art form in something like the original Fallout games, or I think there was a Star Wars game where there were like a bunch of optional side content that you could pursue while you were playing the main game that significantly like fleshed out the world and the storyline of the game. Like there's a lot of stuff that you could get away with when the main thing was mainly computational limits, but you could include a lot of just like pure content because the interface with which the player experienced that content was so low res that adding additional stuff didn't really make a difference.
Yeah.
And now it's so expensive. Like you got to do voice acting for most big games now. So if you want to really flesh out a story, you're SOL because they're only going to pay for so many voice actors to do so many lines in a studio. So
Yeah, one of the things I want to talk about in this 90s book next year is just the fact that there was definitely a loss that was experienced in the fact that we went from like essentially a 2D kind of gaming environment to what we have now, like bigger studios and also 3D, because you know, for all the kind of like, I guess limitations or whatnot of 2D graphics, there were simply far fewer moving parts.
yes.
There were fewer like variables to deal with. So there was definitely kind of like an easier time with if you want to do something that at least simulated artistry,
Mm-hmm.
right? It was easier to do that.
Well, it was
Right.
also a smaller market too. So if you could sell less copies, but relative to the expectations,
Mm-hmm.
it was fine. But now the market is so big and so many people play video games that if you're putting any money into a video game beyond the minimum amount, it's gotta make a pretty good margin or it's not gonna be worth it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the incentive that hits basically every part of the entertainment industry at this point. That's why basically the grand middle of movies between the really dumb shit and at the bottom, like the really lowest common denominator, cheap shit, and the lowest common denominator, expensive shit, like the Hollywood blockbusters or whatever. That great middle ground has mostly disappeared in terms of like big studio financing. I mean, that stuff still gets made with like national arts grants or private foundations or whatever, but it's mostly been eroded away because the incentives are only towards high margins on really cheap stuff and small margins on really expensive stuff.
Yeah.
And there's really not a lot of incentive for people that have money to put that money in, like, say, a $5 million movie that has a chance of making $10 to $15 million. It's yeah, game theory is a bitch, and it has come for the arts in the last 40 years or so. And you'll find people that are like, oh, the arts are there's more variety and interesting stuff that has ever been made. It's like, well, it's not making its way to me, and I bet if you showed me the stuff that you think is examples of it, if you're making that claim, I'm color me highly skeptical.
Yeah. I mean, I'm probably gonna have to dive into, because there are some people like in my old website and other places that recommended different kinds of games to me that are based on like, I guess like it's supposed to be uh, good writing and just like good concepts, and some I guess like not, some of those kind of like novels as games or game,
Mm-hmm.
like whatever they're called. Um, so I'm gonna check some of that out. But honestly, it just feels like there's a conceptual as well as a material barrier that prevents anything from being, usefully artistic, incredibly artistic, right? There's the fact that you need to, kind of like make this money back. There's a kind of like marketplace that's already pre-existing. A lot of this stuff becomes kind of cookie cutter. I mean, even something like the Zelda games, like it's not that I would ever consider like the Zelda franchise going back a few decades to be like great art or anything, but uh, when you look at what happened from, let's say like A Link to the Past to Ocarina of Time, it's like now the kind of like totally like open world, Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom type of shit. It's all like extraordinarily, like everything seems to be going in the same sort of direction, right? It's an
Mm-hmm.
open endedness that doesn't easily lend itself to good writing. Doesn't lend itself to like it may be fun for the user, but it's not the same thing as like being art, right?
Yeah,
Like
it's about getting immersed in a gameplay loop and not necessarily about what that is expressing in terms of the content of the story or whatever that you're supposed to be interfacing with.
Yeah, people have this like opposite view of it, but realistically, the more that you get towards like totally open world, open ended type of gameplay, the further that you get away from the possibility of art, right? Because with art, you're gonna have to constrain a lot of choices,
Mm-hmm.
and obviously, like, even like open world games have like, it's much more constrained than the real world, for instance. But at the same time, that open endedness gives less space for like an actual artistic vision, right? Like a singular thing, right? That somebody's saying, doing, making you think, making you do, giving you choice. Like I've toyed with the idea of like, what would a great book look like that's like a choose your own adventure book? I definitely think it's writable, right? You could do that. You
Yeah.
could write a great work of art that is like a choose your own adventure book from the 90s, right? And like, it's interesting to how those books came to the fore, right around the time that gaming sort of took off.
Mm-hmm.
But now, everything is kind of like gamification in a sense.
Yeah.
Everything is gamified, and everything is like towards that trend, and yet the artistry of it is lost. Like, because the reason why I'm saying specifically a choose your own adventure book having the possibility of great art is, uh, a choose your own adventure still has tons and tons and tons of limitations, right? Much more limitation than choice, right? Just by definition, right? You get, a page, 2 pages, 3 pages, 4 pages, 5 pages of text, and a
Yeah.
single choice that you make after. That's very different from baseline gaming experience.
Yeah. It would have to be the prose equivalent of like uh, what is that, the Siamese sonnets that Dan wrote. Like it would have
Uh-huh.
to, because you really couldn't, it just can't be infinitely branching and still quality. You'd
Mm-hmm.
have to design it so that different pathways still converge on like similar outcomes, and provokes reflection in you about how those differences can converge on the same thing and something like that. You'd
Yeah.
have to take advantage of the form. But I mean, that's what like the best games kind of are, is like a choose your own adventure.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's what the first two Fallout games were, was essentially like you would set your stats and you would get certain responses based on the initial inputs that you did, and then you would get additional different responses based on what you actually did in the game. And in Fallout New Vegas, for example, you can use that to express three different philosophies of or three or more different like political philosophies for how to run an area of territory in a post-apocalypse. And I'm not saying that that's deep, but you can actually explore the implications of like what might drive you to choose like a fascist Rome cosplaying group as your intended rulers of the wasteland, or
Mm-hmm.
what might lead you to choose a clear cognate of the American government, or what might lead you to choose a like libertarian independent fantasy or whatever. And the architecture that they have to build under that to make it work, it's not deep, but it's interesting, and it's engrossing, and it's a better way of using your time than like well, I'm not gonna say than playing Tetris, because I think Tetris is the most useful thing that you can do. But
Mm-hmm.
it's a better use of your time than like the latest first person shooter or whatever. I guess that is a first person shooter game, but like Call of Duty games or
Yeah.
stuff like that, and even probably Zelda. I mean, it's weird, because the more technological power that games have, the better they are at being games, probably. But it almost has like necessitated like lobotomizing large parts of what made the art of original games works, which was the necessary work of the imagination to fill in the gaps that technology could not touch.
Mm-hmm.
Like something like Ocarina of Time, the graphics are extremely dated and the gameplay is somewhat dated.
And that's the thing.
But
Remember when you first played it? Like the
yeah,
graphics were like, "Oh my god, this is so fantastic! I
well,
can't
yeah,
believe how good this is."
because your little kid brain, if you
Yeah.
were a little kid when you played it, like probably most people that watch this channel, if they played it, were, like you filled in the gaps, and these sort of very blunt things. Like I think you've told me, for example, how like when it turns to night in Ocarina of Time and just immediately skeletons start crawling out of the ground to attack you. Like that's very
You
silly,
never played
but
it.
it
You never played
does.
it.
Huh?
You never played it.
No, but I was saying you're the one that reminded me
Oh
about
yeah,
that
yeah,
and
yeah.
pointed out that
Yeah,
like
that's one of the things that I
like
remember most
that's
about it.
basically just a technological limitation. Like there's no way to ease you into like, to make the night creepy in like a subtle way.
Uh-huh.
So they just have to sort of, it's like a binary thing, like, oh, night, skeletons,
Yeah.
But there is something about that speaks to like a child's way of viewing the world. And I think that only happens when you're a child in that game,
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, there's something about gaming, which is like, it's clearly kids media. It is geared primarily towards kids. I mean, there's some adult players, and maybe you're going to have more of them as time goes on. But even
I think adults are a majority now.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, to the extent that they're a majority now, there's still this kind of feeling of like the majority would be essentially arrested children. You know what I mean? Like, they're still in the midst of an arrested childhood. Their taste, their understanding of the arts, the way that they spend their time, it's still very kind of childlike. And there's something to the idea that as you get older, it is supposed to fall away. If this is how the media is geared, if this is where it fits in the marketplace, that's simply going to be like just the kind of like everyday reality, right? There's no way really around that fact.
I feel like as a grown-up, you should get into like the video games that are sort of the video game equivalent of like chess or something like that, like those political strategy games or something like that, where I'm controlling England in the 14th century and I'm trying to conquer Europe or whatever, that kind of stuff. I mean, there's still something a little bit childish about that, but that's basically just like playing with charts and tables that somebody else made, so I can kind of give a pass to that. But yeah, I mean, it's weird because I bought a Nintendo Switch because I kind of thought, I'm really feeling alienated lately. I want to reconnect with something that that really meant a lot to me as a kid, and that was video games. And I didn't spend any money on it because I used to have a Best Buy credit card because it was one of the first credit cards that would actually approve me with no credit. So I had like hundreds of dollars worth of rewards that I never used because I don't go to Best Buy that much. So I just spent all of them on a Nintendo Switch console and a couple of games. I didn't really spend that much money on it, but I really have not used it that much because I can't get into them like I used to.
Yeah,
people that do these like 4-hour videos rhapsodizing about games that they've played or whatever.
Oh my God! As adults, these are adults doing it. I can say, like, if you're a 13-year-old and you found YouTube and you have like a 10 million subscriber YouTube channel, fucking wonderful, right? But I hope when you turn 18 and 25 and 30, you could use 20 million subscribers to bring them over to like actual fucking art, right? We need adults back. And yeah, speaking of speaking of the Switch, I actually got a Switch as a Christmas gift in what was it? It was like back in like 2017, and I mean, since like it's right now, like it's in my attic, and part of me just thinks like, isn't it just kind of so sad that when I was a child, like I would have like done absolutely anything to get a Switch for Christmas, and have the games, and now it's like in my attic.
Well, especially, it's one thing if it's like a little, if someone gets you like a ship in a bottle kit that you just never take an interest in or whatever for Christmas, but knowing the labor conditions that proliferate in the electronics industry and in the video game industry, it's like, somebody really put themselves in danger or like ruined a relationship in order to produce this thing that is now in my possession, and I have no interest in it. And if what you're saying is true, I haven't really tested it. I can't even do anything with it.
Forget what we were even doing. I got so flustered by the branches in my eyes. I now have not even been thinking.
Well, you've never tried to do this with the both of us before, so hard to keep track of two people in a camera.
Maybe we should just like wind this down and switch over to the patron only feed. So if you guys been watching this in the public show, thank you, like, subscribe. But if you want to get more
spicy,
more spice, like this is some crazy ass content. You saw me drunk, you saw me like fucking walking to branches, you saw me almost falling into a Central Park channel. You saw me going down into a mold den. We talked about what? We talked about Noam Chomsky. We talked about video games. We got very, very specific with video games. We talked about poetry. Like that's the thing. At any sort of discrete moment, somebody just like passing by would think like, oh, this is so obviously a gaming channel from two geeks. Oh, this is so obviously a poetry channel. Oh, this is so obviously some sort of like heterodox ex-lib type shit. But really, it's everything all at once and it's nothing all at once. So if you want to get more of that, we're going to continue this conversation in the Patreon feed. That's patreon.com/automachination. See you soon.